interaction. So we will ask you to unmute and ask any question or make a point, which would be good.
Or raise your hands.
Or raise your hand is the other option. Thank you, Henry. Yeah, I forgot about that, raising your hand. And the last thing is we are recording. So William, Chris, Steve, John, Brian, everybody's happy that we're recorded. And without any further ado, we will pass on to Steve. So over to you, Steve. And thank you very much indeed in advance for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Steve. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your time this morning. I'm going to share some slides in a moment, partly because the thing I'm talking about, what we've called magnetic pensions, I've already seen on Twitter people saying, oh, I don't like this idea because ... And it turns out that this idea doesn't involve ... But they've based their views on 140 characters or something on Twitter. So I thought I would, on this occasion, walk you through the issue it is we're trying to solve, why we're concerned about the solutions the government's come up with, and why I think there's a better way. So let me have a go at sharing the slide deck. There we go, put that on slideshow. Okay, Henry, can you see that okay?
Certainly can. I'm hoping we can share these slides, Steve.
I thought you'd already put them on your blog, Henry, but I should think we can probably manage that.
I have already put them on my blog. I wasn't presuming they were the same slides as
with Steve's full permission.
Right, so here we go. So what's the problem that we're trying to solve here? Well, let's have a look at the current active DC landscape. Now, I think one of the things that characterizes this debate is a lot of it is engaged by people in the occupational trust-based world. And if you live in that world, so for example, the domain of the pensions regulator, the responsibility of the Department for Work and Pensions, you kind of think that small pension pots is probably almost a bit of a legacy issue, because in a few years' time, we'll have, let's say, half a dozen big master trusts. Virtually everybody will be in one or other of them. So you won't really lose pots because they'll all be one of half a dozen household name providers. We can move them around, combine them as required, job done. And this first slide is a bit of an antidote to that worldview. So what this chart shows is simply the DC landscape, active savers into DC workplace pensions, excluding own trusts, so excluding single employer trusts, of whom there are over 1,000 with more than 12 members. So I could have had a rather bigger slide with 1,000 schemes of over 12 members going down the page. I thought I'd spare you that. But this is master trusts and contract-based pensions, group personal pensions. And I think it's easy to forget the GPP world. Now, I worked for Royal London some years ago. I don't anymore, but GPP was the only thing Royal London offered, didn't offer a master trust. So I'm a bit more aware, perhaps than some, of the contribution of GPPs to the market. And getting on for 6 million workers in Britain today are actively saving into a contract-based arrangement. And unless there's something going on that I've missed, I don't see any evidence that those insurers are all going to get together and combine their GPPs in a single scheme. So even if we had most people in a small number of large master trusts, we've still got the contract-based world as well. We've still got big single employer trusts run by banks and others. So the landscape is very diverse. And even for a single bar on this chart, a member can have multiple pots. So the innocently labelled L&G there covers the L&G Master Trust and the L&G Group Personal Pension. Within the L&G Master Trust, if you Google it, you find a report for the relief at source bit of the L&G Master Trust and a bit for the net pay arrangement bit of the L&G Master Trust. And you could even have multiple pensions within one of those bits of the L&G Master Trust. So you work for Tesco, who've negotiated a dead good price with L&G. You then work for another company that also uses the L&G Master Trust but has a different pricing structure. So you can have multiple pots in one master trust, multiple pots with one provider across master trust and GPP, multiple pots where you work for a single employer trust, and so on and so on. So the idea that somehow this is kind of some legacy issue and just, you know, a bit of consolidation will sort it, I don't think is accurate. So I think that's really important context when we think about the problem. So what is the problem that we've got here? Well, this is a chart that only goes back 4 years. And first of all, we just look at the number of people actively saving into an occupational DC pension. So there's no group personal pensions on this chart. And one of the curses of this topic is that the data is quite rich in some cases from the pensions regulator, but there's almost no data from the FCA on the GPP market. Ironically, that flips at retirement. We got lots of juicy FCA data at retirement and virtually nothing from TPR, but we'll park that. But this excludes GPPs. But even if you look at occupational DC, so master trusts and other trust-based DC, you can see how steady and stable the number of people actively saving into a DC pension is. So about 10 million 4 years ago, a bit of a dip with lockdown, drift up as the labour force expands, but 10 to 11 million. Now let's overlay that with deferreds. So just 4 years ago, there were roughly the same number of deferred as active DC pots. Now there are getting on for double. And if you rolled forward a year or so. So the DC landscape is filling up with deferred pots. So you can see that just the last 4 years, active pots up 7%, deferred pots up 68%. And if you purely look at occupational DC, trust-based occupational DC, we're talking about nearly 2 million a year new pots being created. Now, for the bluster and the working groups and the consultations and the papers, nothing's been done. So every year, another year goes by and nothing is done. Another 2 million scattered pension pots are created. So I kind of think it's about time we did something about this problem. And if you just think about pot size, now just because I've got a deferred pot with Royal London, it's not under £2,500, but most are. So in 2023, if you look across the whole deferred landscape, including now GPPs, according to the DWP's recent call for evidence, 16 million deferred pots worth under £2,500. 16 million and rising at the best part of 2 million a year. So you can kind of see it's a big problem, it's an urgent problem, it's a growing problem. So next challenge is why we should be concerned about this. And a lot of this will be obvious to this audience, so I'll only skim through it. But I mean, first of all, deadweight cost matters, I think, to us all. So DWP reckon it costs 20 quid a year to run a DC pension. Obviously, it varies hugely, but that's a sort of crude average. So if you're talking about £1,000 pot, even at the charge cap of 0.75%, you're getting £7.50 in charge revenue. So you can see that running a £1,000 pot is loss making. And it doesn't make any sense, does it, for the industry to lose that money because somebody's paying for it. It might be the shareholders or the pension providers, but it's probably coming through in higher charges for everybody. So if we can get that deadweight cost out, that's got to be a good thing. Second point about lost pots, again, just because I have a deferred pot with Royal London, I haven't lost it, fortunately, but lots of these pots, particularly the small ones, the further you go through your working life, become lost. We've got that PPI number of 27 billion. I think anybody knows for sure, but we've got lots of pots and we just don't want people losing their pension. That doesn't make any sense. There's an issue about charges, particularly for flat fee charging, something I think Adrian Boulding has raised in the past, which is where you've got a flat fee applying to a small deferred pot. Although the pot isn't frozen as such, the risk is that the charges eat into it faster than the investment growth builds it. And you could have had a situation where literally someone contacted their pension provider and said, I'd like my pension, please. And the answer was, there isn't one. It's been reduced to zero by charges. So the one thing the government's done on this agenda in the last 10 years by way of legislation was to ban flat fees on pots under 100 quid. Well, hey, that's all they've managed to do in 10 years. But the big one is number 4 here. It's that whole thing about automatic enrolments based on inertia, but we do over time, as people age, as they get towards retirement, gradually want people to get a bit more interested and a bit more engaged. And if all you've got is a whole bunch of scattered small pension pots all over the pension landscape, what's the point? Is it worth even opening the envelope? A family member of mine works what you call gig economy jobs, I suppose, and gets 2 letters from the same pension company on the same day, because she had 2 different jobs with 2 different employers, both using the same master trust, but gets 2 letters from the same master trust on the same day because they're different accounts, and both of them remain unopened. So we've got to get to a situation where actually people are engaged with their pensions. And I think it's a particular issue at retirement, because if your pensions are still fragmented at retirement, so you get to something around, and I think the grey nature of retirement here becomes important rather than a date. If it's a process, you know, you're getting towards state pension age, but perhaps you can't work all the way up to it. What's the logical thing to do? Well, if you've got 2,000 quid over here, 3,000 quid over there, 4,000 quid over there, why wouldn't you just cash them in one at a time as you need the money? Oh, I need the money to replace my car. I need the money to do it at the kitchen. I give the money to the kids towards a deposit on a house, whatever it is. And if it's all fragmented, scattered pots, you don't feel like you're trashing your retirement prospects. You're just taking a fairly small amount of money, getting a bit of tax-free cash, and who doesn't like tax-free cash, and then potentially not behaving in the way that you would if they were all in one place. And I think over time, as these DC pots grow, the consolidated version of these pensions is worth engaging with, whereas the fragmented ones might not be, which undermines the whole point of automatic enrolment. Now, it's not that the government doesn't have plans in this space, as this audience will know very well. So I'm just going to whiz through what it is that they are actually proposing. And part one is focused on that dead weight issue, the pots under £1,000. So this is a micro pot, a dormant pot under £1,000 And the government has in mind the centralized creation of what are known in the jargon as multiple default consolidators, or I think of them as a kind of home of lost pots. So the government will authorize one, maybe two or three central schemes, could be master trust, could be others, heavily regulated, to be the home of these pots. And the idea is to create a new clearinghouse, and just note that this is another bit of structure that the government thinks that we're going to need, simply to get rid of these tiny loss-making pots. Nothing bigger than that at the moment. This is about micro pots. And the idea is that once this pot has lain dormant, 750 quid pot lain dormant for a year, the signal goes from the old scheme to this clearinghouse and says, we've got this pot available for transfer. And then one of the centralized consolidators says, yeah, we'll have that. And unless the member objects, the money goes across. And then when the member creates a second and a third dormant micro pot, the same recipient in each case. So you know, guess what? You could have a pot with Nest or People's or whoever it is, and you could have three £750 pots all in one place. A triumph of government policy there, but there's no legislation for it. And do I think that the priority for a government that's been out of office for 14 years in a first King's speech will be consolidating £750 pension pots? I do wonder if it'll be a priority. It might be, don't know. But you do kind of think, if all this does is get rid of the loss-making pots, is that really ambitious enough? Now, to be fair to the government, even the government doesn't think that's enough, because the government says, well, hang on a minute, we're still creating all these new deferred pots. So why don't we try and find a way of having fewer, or indeed a single pot? And this group, as you know, very familiar with these two big options, but just to make sure we're all using the same language. Member choice floated in the autumn statement. The idea here is that you go to your employer and say, I don't want your workplace pension, thank you very much. I want you to send your contributions and my contributions to this other pension over here. That's member choice. And then separate to that, but possibly subsequent to that, it's not quite clear, it's the lifetime provider model, slightly informed by what happens in Australia, where the process is referred to as stapling, whereby you join your first occupational pension scheme, you're enrolled into it, you change job, and by default, your contributions in the second and third jobs all go back to the first scheme unless you choose otherwise. In Australia, the super funds that service the jobs that 18-year-old Aussies do, so hospitality and that kind of thing, really rather like this scheme. It's not obvious that the hospitality super fund is necessarily the best one, but if you don't take action, that's where your entire lifetime pension pot will be. Now, you may well say to me, well, come on, Steve, you're a good liberal, you know, you'd be in favour of member choice, wouldn't you? What could possibly be wrong with choice? Well, it takes something to unite the Consumers Association, the TUC and Age UK consumer groups who have said they really don't like these ideas. Now, some of the proponents of these ideas have kind of tried to diss the opposition and said, it's just vested interests, just industry vested interests. But actually, the consumer groups, as of one, have said, do you know what? Does this give good consumer outcomes? And they have not been convinced. And I think we should bear that in mind in this discussion. Frankly, there are vested interests on both sides of this debate. I've been trying to think if I've got one, and I don't think I do. I think I'm arguing for the member here. But if anyone spotted a vested commercial interest I'm representing, do let me know. But I can't think who it is I'm lobbying on behalf of here other than the member. So what's wrong? What's wrong with member choice? Well, Automatic enrolment wasn't about high earners, motivated people with financial advisors. It was about ordinary people on average wages and below average wages. You know, the typical person who gets auto enrolled is on 20,000 a year, give or take. And what does all of this mean for them? Well, at the moment, you have a single scheme in a workplace priced on the basis of the entire workforce. And I remember Royal London would go to a workplace, often an SME, they'd look at the entire spread of wages from high to low, they'd work out what the charge revenue would be, and they'd come in with a price. And if there were a lot of high earners in a workplace, and it was a big workplace, they would come up with a lower price. It makes sense. The economics of the scheme added up. If it was a very small workplace, they might charge at the charge cap and even have a monthly fee to make up the numbers. So the presence of high earners in a scheme subsidizes the low earners in the scheme. That's just how it works in many workplace pensions. Well, in member choice, it's pretty obvious who's going to leave the scheme. It's going to be the high earners, the people with the financial advice, the people who are targeted by the marketing. As soon as the high earners leave the scheme, the economics of what's left behind changes. So inertia will still be a powerful thing. Ordinary savers won't be targeted by the marketers, so they get left behind. And the risk is that the provider then says, well, we can't offer the same deal. Now all the lucrative high earners have left, charges go up for ordinary savers. So my exercise of my member choice is detrimental to you. And that doesn't seem like a good outcome to me. But what about the people who choose the best place for their money? Now, clearly, as I say, some of these will have financial advisors. That's great, although many financial advisors may have their own views about the best place for money. But actually, so if I was thinking about the different pensions I've had in my working life, and we've already said they'll be diverse, they could be GPPs and master trusts and own trusts, they could be low cost or invested in an interesting way or great customer service and so on and so on, a good post-retirement offering. There are so many different ways to value and choose between a different historic pension. How on earth are people meant to do that? And isn't there a risk that what will actually happen is whoever's got the slickest marketing or the best app gets the prize? And just to give one sort of slight horror story, I saw a newspaper story the other day. It's about someone how they'd chosen their ISA, not their pension, but I think the same principle applies. And they said, yes, I went for this ISA provider because they have an elephant as their logo, and the elephant is my spirit animal. Now, I'm nothing against people who have an elephant as their spirit animal, but it doesn't seem to me that that's a good basis for choice. So there is a real risk here that if, quote, ordinary savers without financial advice are suddenly shopping this incredibly complex market, then the best marketing might well win out. And linked to that, therefore, is the cost, because this marketing doesn't happen at the moment. You don't get this massive retail marketing to try and poach the top earners from workplace pension schemes. You do in Australia. And guess what? In Australia, much as it's lauded by the government, much as Australian pensions is generally a small number of very big, which ought to be cheap, pension schemes, the average workplace pension in Australia costs more than double the average workplace pension in Britain. Don't forget that. In all this discussion, don't forget that we offer workplace pensions at half the price on average of Australia. That's all deadweight costs, that extra charge, and a lot of that is to do with the marketing of a retail product in what really is a wholesale market. Now, what about employers? Well, employers at the moment can pick one pension provider for the workplace. They can integrate their payroll software. You know, they can have workplace pension engagement with a single provider. It kind of makes sense to do this at scale. Just imagine the joy of being a supermarket with thousands and thousands of employees joining every year. Every new employee, you have to ask them where they want their pension contributions to go to. Presumably, you have to deal with their queries when it doesn't happen properly. Presumably, you have to deal with them changing their mind and wanting their pension contributions to go somewhere else. So employers suddenly have to have all of this extra cost for no obvious benefit. And the ABI have done some research of employers, and many of them said, well, do you know what? If our top earners in particular, or indeed anybody, can just leave and go because they've got one particularly good previous pension, what's the point of us setting up a really high quality workplace pension? What's the benefit for us? So again, the people who are left behind could have their quality of pensions undermined because people like me get to exercise member choice. Well, I'm sorry, I don't think my privilege of exercising choice should be achieved by trampling on people who are left behind. And who's going to pay for all of this stuff? Because I mentioned earlier the clearinghouse for micro pots. You then need another one for these redirected pension contributions, because we're not actually going to ask every employer in the land to have a pipe direct to every pension scheme in the land. It's obviously going to go through some further clearinghouse process. So the employer has to be told by the member where they want the contributions to go. And just imagine the member say, oh, well, I want it to go to Nest, but Nest's actually got 2 pensions for them. So does the member need to know which Nest account number to tell the employer, and what does the employer tell the clearinghouse to make sure it goes to the right account, and what happens in all of that cost? This is all cost, marketing costs, clearinghouse for micropots, clearinghouse for redirected contribution, cost, which we should be driving out of the system, not bringing into the system. So you'll be relieved to know there is a better way. We've called it magnetic pensions. And this image here, that logo there, that avatar thing is me. I asked our design people to come up with a slide, a slightly rotund version of me, I'd like to think, but hey, and here I am with company 1 and pension pot A, first job, chugging along quite nicely. I get itchy feet and I decide to move to company 2, and then I then have what I'm trying not to call pension B at this point, pension pot B. And there I am with my magnetic personality. I've started now, and I've now got 2 probably quite small pension pots, the one I've left behind and the one I have now. And here I am magnetically attaching the old pension to the new pot. So I don't have to do anything. The company doesn't have to do anything. Automatically, that old pot, and I'll explain how this will work in a second, that old pot gets consolidated with my new one. People often think this is a burden on employers. Employers don't have to have anything to do with this process at all. This is a process whereby the new pension scheme automatically receives the pension pot from the old provider. And then here I am again, a bit restless, obviously managed to upset successive employers. I'm now with company 3, pension pot C. You can see that the pension pot B is now a bit bigger than this new one I've started. And this process carries on, and you can see what happens is that I gradually attract pension pot A and B and C and bring them across. Now, you might be thinking, hang on, that's pot follows member, isn't it? Didn't we legislate for that 10 years ago? And we did. So in 2014, the Pensions Act at the time brought in the concept of a pot follows member. But in 10 years' time, nothing's happened. So the primary legislation got through Parliament. Parliament agreed it. But 10 years ago, we didn't have dashboards. Now we do. Now we're on the brink of dashboards in a year or two's time. And pot follows member for the dashboards era is essentially magnetic pensions. The idea is you use the dashboard infrastructure to connect pensions. So small deferred pots follow the worker as they change job with an opt-out. And how do we integrate with the dashboard concept? Well, imagine I'm in, I'm going to say company C for the sake of argument. So I've got Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy from company C. Is that right, Henry? I'll have to check that one later. But anyway, so I'm company C, and I've got this consolidated pot in pot B. So what happens is company C, pension provider C, effectively logs onto the dashboard for me. Obviously, this was done bulk, but metaphorically, they log onto the dashboard. They see this deferred pot. They see that it hasn't been touched for 12 months, and they send a message to the provider B via the dashboard infrastructure that says, we found this deferred pot. It satisfies the rules for an auto transfer. We'd like it, please. And the message goes to the member saying that unless you opt out, this transfer will take place. And you notice what's happened here is the employer hasn't been involved at all. The member hasn't had to be proactive. They simply get the opt-out option, and then the money gets transferred. And it feels to me that in many ways, pot follows member was before its time, because we were thinking 10 years ago about how you'd structure all this and whether you'd have multiple nodes and all that kind of stuff. Well, why not use an infrastructure we're painfully creating at the moment rather than set up whole new ones? So we go on doing this, we build up and we build up until we hit a pot size limit. Now, deferred pots, the size distribution is very skewed. Most deferred pots are very small or fairly small. So actually, you don't have to have a particularly high pot size limit for magnetic pensions to capture the vast bulk of scattered pension pots. But there does come a point where you might well say, let's go no further. Let's not move £50,000 pension pots automatically, £100,000 pension pots automatically. And I'll come on to why that would be. But we do envisage that there would be a limit to this process. And you can do this thing very gradually. So you start with the smallest pot, so a low pot size limit, and you start with the most recent auto enrollment pot. So you literally, in job C, you're taking pot B across. But once it's going and working and tested, you can then raise the pot size limit. And also you can magnetically draw in all of the deferred pots that fit the criteria. So if I've got, let's say this system wasn't up and running and I've actually still got pots A and B, then once this system is up and running, company C, provider C, goes onto the metaphorical dashboard for me, spots pots A and B and sweeps the lot up. So you can see the massive consolidation and simplification that would come about. Now, so why is this, dare I use the word, attractive? Well, something not to be understated is the simplicity of all of this. When we tested this 10 years ago in government, the public just kind of said, yeah, that's right. And in fact, I presented this last week at the LCP DC conference, which was addressed by George Clark, the Channel 4 architect, and we were at the Royal Institute of British Architects, so hence the language about blueprints and all the rest of it. And George Clark, who I've never met before, but a big fan of, particularly now, stood up before he gave his talk about housing and said, well, I'll remove the expletives, but he said, well, it's so obvious, why don't we do it? I thought, great. I mean, he did then go on to say he didn't actually have any pensions, but we'll park that thought. But you know, to a member of the public who just heard this explained, said, well, of course, why wouldn't you do that? And what's proposed instead of this? We're going to have multiple default consolidators. So your 750 quid pot's going to end up with a company you may never have heard of, but your 1,100 pound pot's going to stay where it was, and you can still have 6 or 7 pensions. And then you get a choice between different competing pensions. You don't know what the hell they are, and your employer's got to ask you where you want them to go, and that goes via another clearinghouse. And why not just keep it simple? The beauty of this is it would very quickly consolidate vast numbers of small pots. So it takes out all the deadweight cost. It means that people are building up decent pension pots, and it builds on this existing, or this, this being created dashboard infrastructure. And people say, oh, well, dashboards, I mean, we've been waiting a long time. But, by the time you've got a new government legislating for this stuff, setting up the infrastructure, dashboards, I think, will be live in the next parliament. You're a new government. What's not to like about switching something on that helps people find 27 billion quid of lost pension pots? I mean, you'd be mad as a new government not to implement it. So let's use what we've got. Let's not create something new. Crucially, absolutely central point here is that this approach retains one scheme per workplace instead of individual members going all over the place. So that's cheaper for employers, and it gives you the chance of actually engaging in the workplace that you are in. What's the chances of an employer offering workplace pension engagement if every member is in a different scheme? It's far more likely to happen if everyone is in the same one. And as I've indicated earlier on, crucially, this is good news for ordinary savers who benefit still from one employer negotiating a good deal on one pension arrangement rather than just being left to market forces. And crucially, again, workers build up these meaningful pots, so they engage with a decent amount of money in the current workplace, but you have a threshold that stops constant moving around the pension system. Now, we'll probably discuss this in Q&A. We think that the amount of liquidity in DC pensions, the amount of cash flowing in, billions of pounds a month cash flowing into DC pensions, means that it's pretty easy to do this stuff without undermining things like illiquid assets and so on. But we can come to that point. But we do envisage a cap. We do envisage a member right to opt out. And clearly, if in a new world of VFM and all of that, and people are clear that the scheme they've come from is better and they just don't want this to happen, then they've got the opt-out rights. There will be more information about where you've come from. It'll still be difficult, I think, to interpret, but that reduces the risk of automatic transfer to an inferior scheme. So I'm going to stop with this final slide, Henry, and look forward to getting reactions and comments. So to use a technical pensions term, these small pots are growing like topsy. There are just 2 million new ones a year. Government doing, it's talked a lot, it's done lots of consultations, but nothing's happened, and we've got to get on with this. The current proposal on the table, it seems to me, create a lot of cost, which is going to be borne by members, marketing costs, clearing houses and all that sort of stuff, potentially very complicated and risking poor outcomes, particularly for the ordinary saver for whom auto enrolment was created. Whereas magnetic pensions, if you like, pot follows member for the dashboard era, it builds a structure that we're creating. It makes sense to people and would slash the number of small pots in the system, which would increase the credibility of the whole automatic enrolment program, which I think has been a success, but could be even more of one. So there you go, Henry, whistle stop tour. I hope that's helpful, and I look forward to comments and reactions.
Well, very helpful. We have an immediate question, which I will move to now. It's from our in-house journalist, Mr. Porrig Floyd, always on the calls, always welcome. Porrig, over to you. But you're on mute.
My apologies. Thank you, Henry. There's quite a lot in this I like, Steve, before I start. And I think it's particularly good that you're concerned about a technology issue, and anything we can do to stop a government building a technology platform has got to be a good thing. However, this, and you've mentioned it many times, and you've been quite open about it, this seems to be reliant on dashboards, okay? And pot follows member is not the only policy we were talking about 10 years ago that hasn't been delivered, okay? Now, can this, given its simplicity, be applied if dashboards either don't arrive in the next 18 months or they don't deliver the kind of full functionality we may be expecting and we've been told is coming? Can it be done differently? Because it is simple. Can we, is there a workaround that you've got within your working out that would still allow this to happen, even if, heaven forfend, the dashboard program fails yet again?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason the government didn't go down using the dashboard infrastructure was that they were worried about slowing that down, complicating it, and so on. I don't think they were worried that it would never, that dashboards wouldn't happen. I mean, I'm just not in that camp, Porrig. I mean, I can understand cynicism. I mean, I think, one of my predecessors as minister, I think in 2017 or something, stupidly said, oh, we want dashboards in place by the end of the year or something. Yeah, it was just so much nonsense has been talked, which was never going to happen, and then creates this sense of, oh, it's failed, it's not delivered, and so on. But as I say, if you think imagining, Porrig, you're the new, it's a government of all the talents, and you're the new pensions minister, you're really going to want this dashboard thing to happen. You're going to pull out all the stops because there's more or less no taxpayers' money involved. I mean, a bit because of state pensions, but no taxpayers' money involved. And it's such a wonderful, good news story. And you're going to have many of them. So I think that, the political drive to make this thing happen will be huge. A lot of the work has already been done. Yes, of course, it's been a bumpy road, but, why it should be so uniquely impossible in the UK to do this when, of course, we've got a messy, complex, historic pension system. Of course we have. But, it's not that fundamentally difficult. So I think, I'm very happy to rest, because imagine this is a new government, King's Speech in late 24, legislation in 25 into 26, consultation on regs 27, the timings work for me. But 10 years ago, we didn't know dashboards were coming. So we envisaged kind of, a kind of open banking type approach where you have what they call an API, and you just kind of plug in and you send standard data and one of nodes and people compete, all that sort of stuff. So there was an infrastructure envisaged before dashboards were envisaged. But personally, part of the attraction to me is you don't have to create something new, because the something new would probably be beset by all the same problems as you imply. So I'm an optimist, Porrig, on the record. I'm an optimist about dashboard infrastructure.
Okay, well, we've got two dashboardistas lined up for your next two questions, Steve. So clearly you're winning round certain amount of interest, if not support. First of all, we'll have Alan, and then we'll have Richard, and then we'll come to Richard, who I'm pleased to see Richard Hulbert is also asking a question. So Alan Chaplin.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. And I do like the idea in principle, and I totally agree that dashboard infrastructure supports a lot of it. Have to go and look at some of the detail. I think you'll find, unfortunately, some of the standards don't support all of the things like this, but it's adding data items to standards rather than fundamental infrastructure.
Yeah.
My real question is, you mentioned the point that nothing's been done. Who do you think needs to do it?
I mean, it feels to me like, so, we would like any government of any colour to do this, but the current government chose not to. They made an active choice. They went for multiple default consolidation. The reason they did that was the obsession with illiquids and scale. So they said, hang on a minute, rubbing hands with glee, we can create these central homes of lost pots, and we'll pile up all these little pots in one place, and we can regulate them to death, and they can be low cost, good value, and we can kind of make it a condition that they're allowed to be homes of lost pots that they kind of invest in a sort of government friendly way. And I think they thought, here's a quick way to, a few billion quid of infrastructure investment. Well, this should be about the member. seems to me. That should be the driving factor. And to be honest, you will get an awful lot of consolidation through what we're proposing as well. And I think in terms of who does this, then clearly the government has to legislate to make it, anything done without member consent by and large, particularly across contract-based pensions, you need legislation for. So I will be talking both to, I've already talked to current pensions ministers, but I'll certainly be talking to potential future ones and saying, if you're an incoming government, let's say a Labour government, and you actually care about the average saver, your mindset is not about the well-off person with the financial advisor who you meet at the golf club. It's actually just the average saver, the average trade unionist, dare I say. Actually, you're going to want a solution that works for that group, and this is it. So I would think a new government could do this.
Thank you very much. I see Richard Smith with a somewhat furrowed brow. Richard, I don't look at you with that sort of look of a happy person. I see a worried person.
No, not at all, Henry, and hello, Steve.
Hi,
My initial reaction is, if only 1,500 other voters in Thornbury and Yate had voted differently, we could have had something like this a decade ago.
That's what I think in my dreams every night, Richard.
One of the really positive things is a sort of a practical approach to this. I mean, so often we sort of see policymakers in Caxton House and Stratford and elsewhere, thinking through something very elegant on paper, but haven't really maybe had the experience of trying to put things into practice. But I think, Steve, it's probably, from your experience of seeing auto enrollment play out, key, really deep understanding that people do nothing. That's why AE works, because people do nothing, and small employers want to do nothing as well. In fact, most employers want to do nothing. So we have to play on the people do nothing thing, which is why this would work from a policy perspective. One thing about, so Porrick's question about dashboards, I'm involved in a lot of conversations where people talk about the dashboard as if it's one thing. It's a suite of technology components, and you know this, Steve, and a lot of folk don't understand the core elements that would be reusable are verifying that Richard is Richard, and that's done through a central identity service, and then every scheme doing its own match to say, have I got a pension for this verified person called Richard? Now, Steve, you know this well. You've done research at LCP on matching by schemes, and I've done research with Pension Fusion. Those would be the core elements. Display of pensions on dashboards is irrelevant for this. It's really the ID and the matching, which is the key thing. And I think, Steve, you mentioned this on page 26 of your paper. This is the key element which we'd have to drill into a bit. So if I use a dashboard, I go through the ID service to say, is Richard Richard? And then, assume I get through that, or my verified identity attributes are passed to all schemes. I think the model you're envisaging, Steve, would be that when Richard starts with a new scheme, that scheme on my behalf does that search to prove that my new member is Richard, and then passes those details through that infrastructure to all schemes. Say, have you got a pension for Richard, a small one? In which case, can we? What verb are we going to use for? What does the magnet do? Attract? Can we attract it? Yes. Can we suck it over? I don't know. Whatever. Yeah, but I don't know. You see, the core thing about that ID service, and no one's really talking about this with dashboards, is that I will have to get through the government one login ID service, right? What we would have to do is have a parallel ability for, I don't know, let's call it Nest, to prove that their new member through that ID service is really Richard. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No,
what I would really advocate to move this forward is that we get folk who understand these components of the infrastructure, trying to get it to work in a test scenario, in an agile way. This is the core thing we didn't do with dashboards. We tried to make it perfect in policy before we knew it's going to work. I talk about the German story. Germans got it working with 3 schemes, and now they're rolling out compulsion. What we're doing in the UK, we're trying to force compulsion before we've got an ecosystem that works. We did it exactly back to front. So get it working in an agile basis, particularly the ID service. I'm not sure what my question is, Steve, but just finishing off, when we do that, please can we ensure we test it with consumers? I think, again, what we haven't done with dashboards, we haven't put it in front of consumers. And just a little quick, Steve G, not Steve W. When we do that, please can we make sure we do it with representative consumers? Oh my gosh, I think I saw Lydia join this call, maybe one or two other ladies, but aren't we all old white middle class men on this call? Can we please make sure that whatever we do works for the whole of society, particularly the low to middle income, low to middle income earners? Not sure what my question is, Steve, apart from, do you agree that ID service is going to be the key to it?
Yeah, and one bit of good news in all of this is that the scheme that's sitting on certainly the 750 quid pot has a very strong incentive to get rid of it. So that, you know, they have an incentive to actually get the data right, to make sure that the matches work. So whereas at the moment with the pension dashboard, I go on a dashboard and frankly, it's all a bit of a pain for the scheme that's sitting on my 750 quid pot, and they might send back a partial match because, well, you know, it doesn't matter particularly. Whereas in this world, they really want to get rid of these loss-making pots. So they've got an incentive to make the system work, and that's going to help. But that's a very helpful point. I mean, in my mind, the parallel I've got is delegated access to dashboards. So I, as a well-off individual, can nominate my IFA, if I had one, to you know, log on to the dashboard for me. So the concept of someone logging on for me with the information they need to log on is there in the system. So I think I would build on that. But you understand these things in great depth, Richard. So we would certainly we'd hire you. Let's put it like that.
I'm just thinking of what IFA would take on Steve Webb as a client.
Well, it's a fabulous conversation, and thank goodness this is being recorded, because I think that little snippet should go to John Canavan, who sadly left, and to the whole dashboard program, including our new dashboardista, for their consumption, if it hasn't already gone. But we've got other questions. I want to move on. Richard Hubert, you were next.
Good morning.
Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Morning, Richard.
Hi, Richard.
Just a quick one for you, Steve. Some of the worst performing funds are also some of the biggest. And my concern is that they will be a lot of people will be pushed into some of the worst performing funds. And how do we help people avoid that, or how do we stop that happening?
Yeah. And I always used, so my friend Greg McClymont, who was my Labour shadow when we first came through this, said reasonably, what happens if you transfer from a good scheme to a bad scheme? And I always used to say at the time, to be honest, Greg, I'm more worried about the existence of bad schemes, not for the £750 pot that's just transferred in, but all the poor B infantry in the scheme already. So it seems to me us allowing there to be very poor schemes in the landscape is the bigger problem. And frankly, that would be a problem with any solution around consolidation, for example, member choice, because unless the member's quite savvy, they might go back to one they've heard of, one they're familiar with, even if performance was poor. So part of the answer to this, I think, is the VFM framework. So it's making it easier for people to see what a good pension is, but we shouldn't overestimate people's engagement with all that kind of stuff. So that's part of the reason why we have a pot size limit in all of this. You know, I'm quite relaxed, to be honest, about consolidating a 750 quid pot. I think the advantages probably outweigh the disadvantages, even if there's a difference in performance. I mean, clearly it's bigger, you know, it can be very, very big, and we've got to drive out the poor performers. But you don't want to be moving a £70,000 pot from somewhere where it's doing well to somewhere where it do badly. So I think that's one of the reasons for having a pot size limit. But for an ongoing effort to drive out the poorest performers and to deal with that problem at source, even whether we do consolidation or not, you know, we've got to drive out some very poor performance.
And presumably there would be a members' override, which would allow an individual to choose where they want to go. If they didn't like the idea of heading towards a real dog of a master trust. Not that there are any dogs at master trust, but you know, there are some better than others. Okay, well, the questions keep coming. And next, a very old friend of a lot of us who we haven't seen for ages, but it's great to see you on the call, Alan Hyam.
Hello, Steve. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. You've lost none of your persuasive skills since I last saw you present. So I was interested in picking up the comments that Steve Groves has made, where he says there's at least two reasons why this doesn't work, and anybody who doesn't understand that shouldn't be let anywhere near pension policy, or something similarly strident. He doesn't say what those two issues are, but Steve, do you know what they are? Or are they simply the concern of moving to a worse fund and the utter practicalities of doing it all, which you've already touched on? But if there are any other issues that you think Steve's alluding to there that you want to address, I'd like to hear it.
Yes, I mean, so Steve, as you know, worked for an annuity provider on the day we abolished the requirement to buy an annuity. So I think the the fact of who's proposing this idea may have some bearing on the lens through which he views it. Let me put it just gently as that. But Steve, and particularly Tom McPhail on social media today, are being very critical. And I thought, Henry, it might be useful if I address, because I know Tom's been on here with Michael Johnson and so on advocating, and I respect Tom and I like Tom, and I've thought quite hard to myself, why have he and I come to different answers on this topic? And I think it's one fundamental reason. Do you view workplace pensions as a retail product? And Tom, if you've worked for Hargreaves Lansdown most of your life, and now you work for a firm that advises financial advice firms, you see the pensions world through a retail lens inevitably. Whereas I've worked for Royal London, a workplace pension provider, LCP advise schemes. Obviously, as a policymaker, I would hopefully try and do a bit of both. But I fundamentally think a workplace pension is a wholesale thing, which is what drives value and scale in a market where consumers are ill-informed and weak and disengaged. If you think everybody's engaged and should be shopping around and choosing the best pension, and it's just like broadband, and you choosing a better broadband than me doesn't harm me, well, fine, great. If you're the people you talk to, the people you've served, the people you've worked for, are focused on individual retail investors, generally higher net worth, often engaged and with advisors, member choice is great. I don't disagree with that. That's just not my target market. So I think fundamentally, Alan, the reason people of goodwill can come to different views is the lens through which they look at it. And for me, the lens we must look at this thing through is the average and lower paid worker. That's why the TUC are hostile to the government's agenda, I hope. And that's why I've come down in favour of something that really doesn't rely on engaged members and doesn't, in my view, work to the detriment of the people who get left behind. That's where I am. But I'm sure Steve Groves can pop back on Twitter to to set out his views.
Yeah, well, it is a very polarized position that those two are taking. It's not quite the same position as Steve Groves made clear this morning, and as I'll try and make clear in subsequent blogs. But I think this is a really defining question philosophically about where we go forward with this consolidation debate, and whether we consolidate at the individual level or at the scheme level, whether we want a high degree of paternalism, or whether we want the kind of free market which and on this topic, I will introduce Lord Davis of Brixton, fresh from an all-nighter in Parliament. I'm very pleased that you managed to make it up so early and looking so fresh about it. So, Britt.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yeah. I'm also glad that someone else is wearing a tie.
Yeah, I wore it for you.
Good. I'm not sure. There's much to agree. There's much that's good here, and I'm sure something like this will be worked out. Just initially, I don't really want to be quoted on this, but I'm not quite sure why Steve is so optimistic about what a future government will do. Not because it's potentially an attractive offer. It's I don't know if you've had any discussions, but I don't know anyone who understands any of this. And so there's a big education job to do there. I wonder to what extent we're trying to patch up a fundamentally faulty system. We all agree that automatic enrolment has been a great success, but stemming from the work of the Commission. But the fault of the Commission was they didn't put enough thought into what people were going to be automatically enrolled into. And ultimately, I think, whether it's retail, whether it's wholesale, these sort of pots for people on low income changing jobs is just the wrong way to do it. And we're desperately trying to come up with ways that will solve something, to me, that seems ultimately unsolvable. People may pick up, I'm actually talking about SERPs here as an alternative, but it's there. And I think expecting market-based organisations to provide pensions for people on low incomes is an issue to which there aren't easy solutions. And what we're doing here is trying to patch together a solution for something which I think is ultimately not solvable. And in practice, what's happened here, you get these massive cross subsidies between people and private. The problem here with private sector organisation doing this is that private sector organisations aren't in the charity business. They're not in the income transfer business. They're not in the redistribution business. And so ultimately, try as hard as you want, it's not going to work for people on middle to low incomes, and another option should be available. Just a final question is that, of course, with APPs, didn't have this problem because the Inland Revenue did all the hard work. The downside there is the loss of the employment, loss of the involvement of the employer. And that clearly was a big problem, but I'd just be interested in Steve's. Have you thought about using the Inland Revenue as the way of solving some of these problems?
Yeah. Wow, and thank you, Bryn. It's very decent of you to spend the hour with us, especially after all last night's excitement. And I'd kind of just assuming that you would be the next Labour pensions minister in the Lords. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful of a well-informed minister. I mean, the one tip they used to give us as a minister is, don't tell the civil service how you want something done. Tell them what you want to achieve. And I think it's particularly for a new government, for new ministers who, no criticism of them, may not have massive background in the subject they're based into. It's very difficult to have that depth of knowledge. The starting point must be, okay, officials, this is what I want to achieve. Here are my values. Here's my manifesto. Here's the groups I'm most concerned about. Let's talk about how we deliver that. And then obviously in office, you start to learn the brief and all the rest of it. You engage with people and you form your thoughts. But I think a Labour minister who came in and said, look, I'm concerned fundamentally about pension outcomes for people on middle and lower incomes. They're the people who the system wouldn't otherwise serve well. How can we do better for them? Might well steer in more, in my view, in this direction that doesn't undermine wholesale workplace provision. So I'm more of an optimist, but we are, of course, talking to potential future ministers and sharing these thoughts. Just on the certs point, because I see Andy Young has joined us and is already virtually heckling. I mean, I used to be asked by, I think it was Ronnie Campbell, I believe possibly now the late Ronnie Campbell, I'm not sure, but a Labour MP on the front bench, who always on the opposition benches, who always used to say to me, "Oh, SERPs, we don't need all this private, it's all these nasty private companies making profits from people. We should just have state pensions and be done with it." And I think my fundamental problem there, and Andy tweeted the other day, but really what we need is SERPs, because SERPs was a proper pension. But of course, SERPs brought in 78. And then slashed in the 80s, and then slashed again in the 90s, and then abolished. And the age at which you could draw your SERPs was put up by future governments. So, as a saver into retirement, I want my eggs in two baskets. I do want a state pension. I want a good foundational earnings linked and better state pension to get me that start. And then I want some property rights. I actually want some assets that my employer has paid half the cost of, that I can take at a time of my choosing. That, all right, governments can do what governments do and they can inflate away the value and all the rest of it. But in principle, it's far more concrete and mine than just a SERPs promise that, frankly, a future government might say we can't afford, so we'll make you wait an extra 2 years for, or something like that. Apologies, the late Ronnie Campbell. And I used to say to him, I respect the view that the state can do this stuff well, but as a person, I want a future pension promise I can be confident in, and I want my pension not to be wholly dependent on future generations of politicians, because I've met them and they can change the rules. So I kind of think a bit about, I'm a passionate believer in a good redistributive foundational state pension. I'm absolutely in favour of that, but I don't want my whole pension provision to come from that, which is why I want to make the rest of the system work.
Thank you, Steve. Andy is on the call, and if he wants to put his hand up, he is very welcome too. He's also got the right to not do so. So I'll leave it at that. Bryn, do you want to write a reply, or are you happy for us to move on? Alan has got his hand up. I don't know if that's a legacy thing, Alan, or whether you I have another question to ask.
No, I just think a lot of the problems we're trying to solve today are a consequence of the overall design, and I have a lot of sympathy with what Bryn says, and indeed what Andy says, but to an extent we are where we are, and we have to solve today's problems that have been created by the way that auto enrolment was implemented in the first instance. And I do think, as somebody who spent a lot of time trying to engage with a whole range of people, both high earners and low earners who rely entirely on state pension, that going with inertia, designing solutions that work best for the mass people, because the people who have more money and more savings will be able to find their own path more easily, is the right way. So on a philosophical bent, I do come down more where Sir Steve Webb's got to, rather than Tom McPhail on this issue. So it's just the enormous challenge of the technology and the people and the systems. It's not my bailiwick, but I'm really skeptical that will actually work, and it'll be that will let this idea down.
I'm very grateful to Ian McIntyre for stepping in to stop me from having to ask any more questions. I am conscious that David Robbins had his hand up. No, he doesn't want to ask a question. Ian, fine, fire away.
I was going to ask a different question, but I'd just like to touch on that point we just made there. I don't think the technology necessarily is a problem. I think, you know, a variation on technology for either solution has been achieved. What they have in Australia, you know, the actual ability to do this is there. It's not a small issue, but it is achievable if there is the will, if there's the political will. I think we have certain issues in this country, like not being able to use national insurance number, which will make it a lot easier, but that's the side. I'd actually like to ask Steve a different question. So I'm very aware, because I'm actually on one of the working groups, we're often designing a solution for a multiple consolidator. At what point does that get to a point where you can't stop it, Steve, even if you may be right?
Thank you, Ian, and nice to see you again as a former Royal London colleague.
Indeed, been a
so
while.
Yes, so I'm aware that work is going on. When I say nothing's been done, I mean as in nothing that's actually changed anything yet. And I'm aware a huge amount, you know, yourself, Andy Cheseldine, lots of people, some on this call have been on working groups, and I think a lot of that work has not been in vain. I mean, I think we've all learned a lot in the last 10 years about small pots, how they're created, how different they might be. The master trusts who tried the member exchange pilot, I think, learned a lot of quite painful lessons about, you know, it sounds a bit obvious, you know, People's Pension and Nest are sitting on millions of members in common, can't they just, you know, play swapsies? And it turns out it's not quite as simple as that. So I think a lot of this work is not in vain. For me, I'm an economist who doesn't think that sunk costs should change your future behaviour. You know, if an idea is not a good one, you just pull the plug. And I think, you know, we're going to get a new government probably at the end of this year who are inevitably going to take a fresh look at stuff. And frankly, there is a risk, I think, in government where stuff just happens because it's already happening and the momentum's there and you carry on. And the reason we've put this paper out now is to say, hold on, the decision hasn't, you know, there is no legislation, it hasn't happened yet. This is the chance to think again, particularly as a fresh government's going to take a fresh look. And I take the challenge. So Tom McPhail sometimes does a good talk on how terrible all these fragmented small pension pots are, and then says, ergo my solution. And it's like, well, if you don't agree with his solution, you then have the challenge of, well, what would you do, mate? And here's our response. So I think we've tried to say, here's something that actually works for the future, works for a new government coming in, about hopefully to see dashboards go live. And just on your point about NI numbers and HMRC, because I didn't answer Bryn's question on that, is because the thing that works well in Australia is it's all done through the tax office, the dashboards are run through the tax office, the unique tax identifier, it kind of works. We just don't have that. I mean, the number of members of the public contact me say, people contact me who don't have a national insurance number. People contact me who have two. People that contact me who have national insurance numbers that have changed, you know, and so on and so on. So we can't just give it to the tax office to fit. There's a whole bunch of people who have no engagement with the tax office, you know, beyond potentially not even having an NI number. So clearly, you know, it would be, you wouldn't start from here, would you, is always the way. And I think the final thing I'd say, Henry, is, you know, although this is in one sense a legacy issue, you know, we've got 10 years odd since auto enrolment and pensions before then scattered, we are adding to this legacy at an alarming rate. And even if we cleared up all of history, we're still going on creating new small pots. There's nothing in anything I've heard that won't create new ones. So that's why I think we need a systematic solution.
Well, I mean, that's a great note on which to end. It's also 11:31, so it's a good time to end. I think we'd all like to thank Steve for such a clear exposition of his ideas. And I'd like to thank all the people who've spoken and everybody on the call, because it's been a good one. And because I think this is something which we can cut and paste off to other parts of the system, including the dashboard ecosystem, so that people can get a clearer idea of one of the alternatives to the pot for life carousel ideas currently in the DW's head. And clearly we are entering into a new government, whether that be the old government revived or a genuinely new government is yet to be decided, but I think we know where the odds are. And it's great to see a representative of that new government on the call as well. There may be many who join them. But I'd like to really finish by handing back to Steve, who'll do the usuals, and saying, keep coming to these things, because they're some of the most interesting and positive debates that I get to see, and they happen every week. And for most of us, they happen for free, and they're really valuable. So thank you very much, everyone, and especially to Steve.
Yeah, Steve, thank you very much indeed. And I know you're doing another session today at the Bright Blue think tank, so I hope that goes well and your voice holds out.
Thank you.
But a fantastic presentation. And the slides, if anybody would like the slides, then please email me or Henry. And obviously Steve direct, you've probably got his email address, and a fantastic content in that, and an interesting concept of magnetic pension. So let's see where that goes. But brilliant, really good. Next week, we have Phil Calvert, who is a writer and an author, talking about the wonderful world of AI and sales and marketing and closing sales, which should be a bit of a change from the usual, but very enjoyable no less. So today's video will be up and running very shortly on the website. And I think Henry will post that out very shortly as well on his social media platforms. Really appreciate everybody's input. As Henry says, it's a great platform for everybody to join, debate, challenge, and long may it continue. So, if you are a member, great. Thank you very much. If you could voluntarily donate, that would be even better. If you're not a member, please join. We'd love to have you on board as an official Playpen member. And if you like it so much and you want to share it with friends, you can use the Share It with Friends tab. So please invite others to join as well. But I hope you enjoyed it. As we usually say on these weekly occasions, let's pray for peace in the East and peace in the Middle East. And let's ensure that we're all safe and well in the future going forward. And you never know. Yeah, we might have an Iron Dome in the next few months or years. So enjoy, everybody. Thanks very much for joining. Cheers to Steve.
Thanks all.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.